Hey guys, it's Sandeep from RevAtlas and welcome to our review of the Poco X2 smartphone. Now before we get started, please do make sure to hit the subscribe button and do turn on notifications to make sure that you don't miss any of our videos. Now let's get this video started. So let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Yes, the Poco X2 is in fact the Redmi K30 4G variant that's available in China. Does that make it any lesser of a device though? No, it doesn't. And they could have actually called it the Poco X2 in China in the first place, and perhaps people would have found it a bit easier to digest, but the name doesn't take anything away from the device itself, and allow me to explain why. Leave aside the fact that Poco does not exist in China right now. The price was a large reason why the original Poco F1 did get the success that it did initially and why it received a lot of buzz upon release. But the whole reason why people continue to buy it even in 2020 is because of the kind of support that it has enjoyed both from Poco themselves in the form of updates as well as in terms of having very active communities dedicated to improving the features with time. We've spoken about this in length, especially in our latest video that tells you whether to buy a Poco F1 in 2020 or not, and Poco has ensured us that it's committed to the cause as well, and they plan to limit the number of devices they launch in order to ensure that they're able to deliver on the promise and updates in a timely manner. To start things off, the Poco X2 comes with MIUI 11 for Poco with Android 10 out of the box and will be available in 6 or 8GB of RAM and 64, 128 or 256GB capacities in terms of storage. Storage is UFS 2.1 and is expandable via the hybrid SIM slot. You also get a Type-C port and IR blaster, which I still feel is something that more brands need to include. The processor is one particular aspect where I feel many would expect the X2 to be packing a flagship processor, and while the 730G isn't one, you could call it flagship grade. Yes, the 765 would have been better, but that also would have increased costs, especially with unnecessary 5G modem, which again goes against the Poco motto of everything you need and nothing you don't. Regardless, the performance was great, and to be honest, processors have come a long way, and unless someone really pushed it to its limits, there was no real way of telling that it was running a 700 series processor under the hood. It just ate up just about whatever we threw at it, be it photo editing, multitasking, gaming, etc. Gaming in particular is a great experience on the X2, not just because of the large 6.67 inch screen, but also because it supports 120Hz refresh rate. Now I know that you may be thinking, can you really tell the difference between 120Hz and 90Hz? After all, there are people who can't even tell the difference between 60Hz and 90Hz. Well, I would say yes, but I would also agree with you by saying that the effect is less noticeable from 90 to 120Hz compared to going from 60 to 90Hz, and this holds true mainly for your everyday use while browsing, navigating the UI and other tasks, but it does get more pronounced when gaming, and there's already a large library of games that can do 120Hz, so it may not be as niche as you think. Android Authority has compiled a nice list that you can refer to, and I shall link it in the description below as well. Coming to a screen itself, the panel is an IPS1 and has Full HD resolution in 20:9 aspect ratio and is a really large screen and one that you can thoroughly enjoy content on. It's only interrupted by the dual cameras at the upper right corner, and funnily enough the cameras are two separate modules and don't actually form a pill shape, but yet the screen itself is blank in between them and creates that shape. The Poco team told us that tests internally pointed to people preferring that as opposed to having two dots on their screen. I asked whether they could bring about customizability in terms of perhaps allowing people to choose whether they want two dots or just a pill, or maybe just even use that space to display something else like the battery level or percentage for example. They said that if the hardware supports it, that's something that they could do, but they weren't sure at the moment. I did also check reports that stated that the 120Hz screen wasn't really 120 or that it felt sluggish, but in my experience that wasn't the case. It felt like a proper 120Hz display and I was worried mainly about the brightness. Xiaomi screens, particularly in the sub 20k segment, aren't too bright, but this gets pretty bright even in 120Hz setting, and while I would still pick an AMOLED any day, I could use this comfortably even under direct sunlight outdoors, but we noticed that this was made possible when you set it to auto brightness mode with or without tweaking, as opposed to switching off auto brightness and then tweaking it. It also does support L1 wideband, and we made sure to double check for HD support on Netflix and Prime, and it does play videos in HD. Having a huge screen definitely means that you'll have a huge device, but to be honest, the X2 doesn't feel as large or unwieldy as the spec sheet might suggest. In fact, it feels thinner despite being the same thickness as the 70 Pro, and while the spec sheet might disagree as the X2 is wider, it actually does feel narrower and it feels lighter, but it's actually 2 grams heavier. This is due to good weight distribution and a taller aspect ratio that really help here, and overall I feel is ergonomically more sound compared to the 7 Pro and 70 Pro devices. Perhaps a little less refined when you look at the bezel around the screen and the lack of a curved display, but in terms of actual build quality and the in-hand feel is top notch. Gorilla Glass 5 at the front and back, and while the circular ring design around the camera is something that looks off in photos, in real life I think it looks better and definitely breaks the monotonous large back panel that's otherwise uninterrupted. The two front-facing cameras that we mentioned earlier, well, one is a 20MP f2.2 camera, while the second one is a 2MP depth sensor. This 2MP depth sensor also makes a guest appearance at the back as well, but you really should be focusing your attention to the 64MP Sony IMX686 with f1.9 aperture, which is ever so slightly larger at 1 by 1.7 inches compared to 1 by 1.72 inches of the Samsung GW1 64MP sensor. It does seem to be better than the Samsung sensor at first glance, but we'll dive deep into that during our camera review and comparison videos. You also get a 2MP depth sensor and 8MP ultra wide angle camera, and so far the cameras are promising, and here are some samples, but do watch our camera review to get to know about it in full. You might be wondering where the fingerprint scanner is, considering that there isn't one at the back and there isn't one under the display since it isn't an AMOLED panel. Well, Poco has put it in the side that's housed within the power button. Placement is excellent, and the depressed groove that the power button is housed in is great too. It's a physically clickable button with a sensor inside it, and we have seen such implementations on the side from Sony, Nextbit, and as a result Razer as well, and I've always been a fan of it. Having it on the back is great, as capacitive sensors are still faster than in-display ones, even though the latter have gotten faster. But when on a table, the sensor is inaccessible, and this solves that issue. So ideally you'd be registering your thumb on your right hand as well as your index fingers on both hands. Index finger on the left because when you grab the phone with the left hand, the index finger falls on it, and index finger from the right is basically when you need to unlock it, say when it's on the table. It can be configured to detect either when you physically press the button or by just tapping the sensor. I find the latter better, especially considering how quick it is to detect it. It's really fast, and lastly you also get a regular face unlock mechanism which is also quite fast but not quite as quick as the fingerprint scanner itself. Still useful though. There's still a headphone jack luckily at the bottom, which means that audiophiles can enjoy wired audio. The audio quality is also pretty good as it has good frequency response and there's little to no distortion even at peak volume, and the bass is thumping as well. However, the max volume seemed lower than what you would have expected, particularly when trying to drive gear with higher power needs. The same applies to a speaker as well. It's not very loud, it's mono and bottom firing, but the main disappointment was that it didn't sound too great either, and the audio quality seems to be the Achilles heel of the X2. The battery itself is a 4500 mAh unit that charges at a max of 27 watts, and there is such an adapter included in the box as well. The charger can top up a dead battery in around 1 hour and 10 minutes, and a half an hour of charge gets you a bit over 50%. While the 500 mAh bump is great, you have to factor in things such as a larger screen with double the refresh rate, and the fact that it uses an IPS panel instead of AMOLED, especially when you compare it to a device like the Redmi K20 for example. But surprisingly, the battery life is great. Even with 120Hz, you can easily get a day of use out of this, even for heavy users. If you prefer SOT, then you're looking at around 7 hours with 120Hz enabled, and even getting close to 8 hours at times, while 60Hz will give you around 2 hours more, but it really isn't worth the difference if you ask me. While this probably isn't the F1's successor if you look at it spec by spec and try to see what it would have been in 2020, it still does follow the same value spiritually and is a more pocket-friendly offering, as the X2 provides great value for money at the price point, but anyone buying this would probably do so also expecting the other two factors that we mentioned earlier about updates and community, and that is a great start. Below 20k rupees, there's no other phone that I recommend or rather use myself even, but the question still remains though, where is the Poco F2? Thanks for watching this video, hope you liked it, see you again in the next one, and please don't forget to hit the subscribe button.